The wind howled like a wounded animal across the snow-covered plains of Wyoming Territory, 1872, as Mason Reed pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders. Something wasn't right. The tracks he'd been following for 3 days had led him here, to this abandoned mining outpost nestled in the foothills of the Medicine Bow Mountains. A place that should have been deserted now held whispers of human presence, fresh boot prints in the snow, smoke lingering in the frigid air, though no fire burned visible. Mason dismounted from his dappled gray stallion, Storm, letting the reins hang loose as the well-trained horse stood steady against the bitter wind. His gloved hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached the dilapidated structure that once served as the mining office. Boards creaked beneath his weight as he climbed the snow-dusted steps, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Hello?" he called out, voice carrying across the empty landscape. No response came, just the persistent moan of the wind through the cracks in the weathered walls. He pushed the door open with the toe of his boot, wincing at the screech of rusted hinges. The interior was dark, save for thin strips of daylight filtering through gaps in the walls and roof. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something unusual: footprints in the dust, fresh ones, leading toward a trap door in the corner that presumably led to a cellar or storage area. Mason drew his revolver, the weight familiar in his hand. "Anyone down there? I ain't looking for trouble." A sound caught his attention, faint, almost imperceptible beneath the wind's howl. A whimper, perhaps, or a muffled cry. Human, definitely human. Cautiously he crossed the room, boards protesting beneath his weight. He holstered his gun to grasp the iron ring of the trapdoor, heaving it open with a grunt. Darkness greeted him, along with the musty smell of earth and something else, the unmistakable coppery scent of blood. "I'm coming down," he announced, reaching for the lantern he carried in his saddlebag. After lighting it, he descended the crude ladder into the cellar, the flame casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. What he saw made his blood run cold. A woman sat huddled against the far wall, her wrists and ankles bound with heavy iron chains anchored to the wall. Her dress, once fine, from the looks of the fabric, was torn and soiled. Dark hair hung in tangles around a face smudged with dirt, and what appeared to be dried blood from a cut above her brow. Despite her condition, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. When she looked up, her eyes, a startling shade of green, widened in recognition. "Mason," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse or perhaps from screaming. "You're the only one I knew would come." The words struck him like a physical blow as recognition dawned. "Sophia?" he breathed, scarcely believing his eyes. Sophia Montgomery? It had been 5 years since he'd seen her last, on the day she'd boarded a stagecoach heading east to marry some wealthy banker her father had chosen. 5 years since he'd watched her leave, taking his heart with her. The woman he'd loved in secret since they were barely more than children. Mason rushed forward, setting the lantern on the ground as he knelt beside her. "My God, Sophia, what happened? Who did this to you?" Her chapped lips trembled as she tried to speak, but instead, a sob escaped. Without thinking, Mason pulled her into his arms as best he could, with the chains restricting her movement. She felt so small, so fragile against him. Nothing like the spirited young woman who used to race him across the open plains on horseback. "It's all right now," he soothed, though he knew it was far from all right. "I'm going to get you out of here." He examined the chains sturdy, but the locks were simple. He could pick them with the tools he carried in his saddlebag. "Can you tell me who did this?" he asked gently, removing his coat to wrap around her trembling shoulders. Sophia drew a shaky breath. "My husband, or rather, the man who was supposed to be my husband." Her voice strengthened slightly with each word. "Theodore Blackwell? The marriage was a sham, Mason. He never intended to honor it. He wanted my father's railroad investments. And when father died last year, Theodore showed his true nature." Mason felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice calm. "Where is he now?" "Gone to Laramie, to finalize the sale of what was my father's legacy. He left his men to watch me, but there was some kind of disagreement. I heard shooting 2 days ago, and no one has been back since." She looked up at him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How did you find me?" Mason reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. I've been tracking a gang that's been rustling cattle from ranches around Cheyenne. Their trail led me here." He paused, a faint smile touching his lips, despite the gravity of the situation. "Though I reckon now that finding you was what I was meant to do all along." He stood, retrieving his tools from his saddlebag. "Let's get these chains off you. Then we need to get you somewhere warm and safe. My cabin's about a day's ride from here." As he worked on the locks, Sophia watched him, her gaze intent. "I tried to send word to you. After Father died, Theodore intercepted my letters." Mason's hands paused momentarily. "You wrote to me?" She nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering across her face. "I never stopped thinking about you, Mason. Not once in 5 years." The first lock clicked open, releasing her right wrist. Mason gently rubbed the raw skin where the manacle had chafed. "I thought you'd forgotten all about me," he admitted softly. "The rough cowboy who wasn't good enough for Judge Montgomery's daughter." "My father was wrong about many things," Sophia said, wincing as the second lock released her left wrist. "But most of all, about you." When the final chains fell away, Mason helped Sophia to her feet, supporting her as her legs trembled from disuse. He guided her up the ladder, one careful step at a time, steadying her when she swayed from weakness. Outside, the snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Mason whistled for Storm, who trotted obediently to his side. "Can you ride?" he asked Sophia, concern etching his features. She nodded determinedly. "With your help, I can do anything." Mason lifted her onto Storm's back before mounting behind her. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding the reins with his free hand. "We'll head for my cabin," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "It's not much, but it's solid, and there's plenty of firewood stacked. We can decide what to do about Blackwell once you're safe." As they rode away from the abandoned mining outpost, Sophia leaned back against Mason's chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. For the first time in months, she felt hope stirring within her. She wasn't naive enough to believe that her troubles were over. Theodore Blackwell was not a man to let anything he considered his property slip away without consequence. But for now, in this moment, with Mason's arms around her, she allowed herself to feel safe. The journey to Mason's cabin was arduous. The snow fell heavier as the day progressed, and the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Mason kept Storm at a steady pace, not wanting to push the horse too hard with a double burden. Occasionally, he would stop to check their surroundings, always alert for any sign of pursuit. Sophia drifted in and out of consciousness, exhaustion, and the gentle rocking motion of the horse lulling her despite the cold. Each time she stirred, Mason's arm would tighten reassuringly around her waist. "Not much farther now," he murmured as twilight settled over the landscape. "Just over that ridge." True to his word, they crested the hill to reveal a small cabin nestled in a copse of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a warm light glowed from the single window. "Someone's there," Sophia said, tensing in his arms. "My ranch hand, Miguel," Mason explained, guiding Storm down the slope. "Good man, trustworthy. I told him to expect me back today." As they approached, the cabin door swung open, and a man stepped out, rifle in hand. Upon recognizing Mason, he lowered the weapon. "Senor Reed," Miguel called, hurrying forward to help. "You found what you were looking for, I see." "More than I expected," Mason replied, dismounting before gently lifting Sophia down. Miguel's eyes widened as he recognized the state Sophia was in, but to his credit, he asked no questions. "I will take care of the horse. The stew is hot on the stove." "Thank you, Miguel," Mason said, supporting Sophia as they made their way to the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the savory smell of the stew were almost overwhelming after the bitter cold. Mason helped Sophia to the single chair near the hearth. "I have some clothes that might fit you," he offered, moving to a trunk in the corner. "They belonged to my sister before she married and moved to California." Sophia accepted the simple cotton dress and woolen shawl gratefully. Is there somewhere I could wash?" Mason nodded, retrieving a basin and pitcher of water. "I'll heat this for you. There's a screen in the corner you can use for privacy." While he busied himself warming the water and setting out soap and a towel, Sophia took in her surroundings. The cabin was small but neat, with a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, the hearth with its cooking area, and various tools and supplies organized on shelves along the walls. It spoke of a man who lived simply but with care. "It's not much," Mason said, noticing her gaze. "Nothing like what you're used to, I reckon." Sophia shook her head. "It's perfect. It feels like a home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. After Mason had prepared everything for her, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll step outside while you wash and change. Take your time." Left alone, Sophia stood on shaky legs and made her way behind the screen. She peeled off her filthy, torn dress, wincing at the bruises and scrapes that marred her skin. The warm water was heavenly as she washed away the grime of her captivity, careful around her wounds. The simple dress Mason had provided fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist. She had lost weight during her ordeal. As she braided her damp hair, she caught a glimpse of herself in a small mirror hanging on the wall. Her face was thinner, with shadows under her eyes, but there was color in her cheeks again. When Mason returned, he paused in the doorway, struck by the transformation. Even in the simple dress, with her hair damp and her face bearing the marks of her ordeal, she was beautiful to him. "Better?" he asked softly. Sophia nodded. "Much. Thank you." Miguel had tactfully made himself scarce, retreating to the small bunkhouse behind the cabin where he normally slept. Mason served up 2 bowls of the hearty stew, and they ate in companionable silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. When Sophia had eaten her fill less than Mason would have liked, but more than he expected given her weakened state, he gathered their bowls and set them aside. "You should take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Sophia looked as though she might protest, but exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. She nodded gratefully. "Tomorrow," Mason continued, "we need to decide what to do about Blackwell. Laramie is not far, and if he's there handling business, he'll be back for you soon enough." A shudder ran through Sophia at the mention of her captor's name. "He won't stop looking," she said quietly. "He believes I know where my father hid certain documents, papers that would prove the railroad shares he's claimed are rightfully mine." Mason's brow furrowed. "Do you? Know where they are, I mean?" Sophia's lips curved in a small, secretive smile. "Yes. My father never trusted Theodore. Before he died, he told me where he had hidden proof of my inheritance. Theodore has been persuading me to reveal the location." The implications of her words made Mason's blood boil. The marks on her skin, the chains, all attempts to break her spirit and force the information from her. "We'll need to retrieve those documents," he said, mind already working on a plan. "But first, you need rest. We both do." He helped her to the bed, tucking the quilt around her as she lay down. As he turned to move away, her hand shot out, grasping his wrist. "Stay," she whispered. "Just until I fall asleep. I'm afraid to close my eyes and find this has all been a dream." Mason hesitated only briefly before sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm real, Sophia, and I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze for a long moment before her eyes fluttered closed, her hand still clinging to his. Mason watched as her breathing deepened and her grip relaxed. Only then did he gently disentangle himself and move to his makeshift bed by the fire. As he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he knew sleep would be long in coming. Finding Sophia had stirred up feelings he'd thought long buried. 5 years he'd spent trying to forget her, building his small ranch, making a life for himself, and now here she was, back in his life, needing his protection. Mason knew that helping her reclaim her inheritance meant facing the man who had hurt her, potentially bringing danger to his doorstep. But there was no question in his mind about what he would do. He would protect her with his life, if necessary. Outside, the wind continued to howl and snow piled against the cabin walls. But inside, warmed by the fire and the presence of the woman he had never stopped loving, Mason Reed finally drifted into sleep, his hand resting on the Colt revolver beside him. Morning came with a stillness that spoke of heavy snowfall. Mason woke to find Sophia already up, standing by the window, gazing out at the white landscape. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating her profile. And for a moment, he simply watched her, remembering another time, another place when they were younger and the world seemed full of possibilities. "How long has it been snowing?" she asked without turning, somehow sensing he was awake. Mason rose, stretching out the kinks from sleeping on the floor. Started yesterday afternoon. Looks like we got a good 8 inches, maybe more. Will it delay him? Theodore, I mean. If he's planning to come back to the mining outpost, yes. But it also means we're going to have a harder time getting to Laramie to retrieve your documents. Sophia turned to face him, determination clear in her green eyes. I'm stronger than I look, Mason. I can make the journey. He couldn't help but smile at her spirit. I never doubted that for a minute. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Miguel entered, stamping snow from his boots. Buenos dias, he greeted them. The snow has stopped for now, but there's more coming later today, according to my bones. He rubbed his knee for emphasis. Mason nodded, familiar with the ranch hand's uncanny ability to predict weather. We need to make a journey to Laramie. How are the horses? Storm is rested. The mare is also ready. But for the señorita... Miguel's gaze traveled to Sophia, concern evident. It is a hard ride in this weather. I can do it, Sophia insisted. Mason and Miguel exchanged glances. We'll take it slow, Mason decided, and if the weather turns, we'll find shelter along the way. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, they prepared for the journey. Mason lent Sophia a heavy coat, gloves, and a hat with ear flaps to protect against the cold. He also strapped on an extra pistol, tucking it into his belt at the small of his back. Can you use this? He asked, holding out a smaller revolver to Sophia. She took it, checking the chamber with practiced ease that surprised him. My father taught me. He believed every woman should know how to protect herself. Smart man, Mason commented, adding another layer to his growing respect for the late Judge Montgomery. Perhaps the man had been wiser than Mason had given him credit for. Miguel helped them pack provisions and extra blankets. I will keep watch here, he promised. If anyone comes looking, I will say I have not seen you. Mason clasped the man's shoulder gratefully. We should be back in 3 days, 4 at the most. If we're not... He left the implication hanging. I understand, Miguel said solemnly. Go with God, my friends. The ride to Laramie was arduous, the trail covered in snow that concealed rocks and dips in the terrain. They traveled in single file, Mason leading on Storm, Sophia following on the more docile mare, Daisy. Despite the challenging conditions, Sophia rode with the confidence of someone who had spent much of her life on horseback. They stopped frequently to rest the horses and to allow Sophia to warm herself by small fires Mason built. During these breaks they talked, filling in the 5-year gap in their knowledge of each other's lives. Mason told her about building his small ranch, starting with just a few head of cattle and gradually expanding. He spoke of his sister's marriage and move to California, of the friends he'd made and lost in the territory. In turn, Sophia shared the story of her life in Boston, the suffocating society parties, the growing realization that Theodore Blackwell was not the gentleman he pretended to be. She described her father's illness and his deathbed, warning about Theodore's true nature. He apologized, she said softly during one of their stops, staring into the small fire, for sending me away from Wyoming, for not listening when I told him where my heart truly lay. Mason looked up sharply from where he was adjusting Daisy's saddle. What did you tell him? Sophia met his gaze steadily. That I had left my heart with a cowboy in Wyoming Territory, that no society gentleman could ever compare to the boy who taught me to ride bareback and shoot straight. The admission hung between them, as tangible as the snowflakes that had begun to fall again. We should get moving, Mason said after a moment, his voice rough with emotion. There's a line shack about 5 miles ahead, where we can spend the night. The line shack proved to be little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a small iron stove in one corner and a crude bunk built into the wall. It was shelter, though, and after tending to the horses in the lean-to attached to the shack, Mason set about building a fire in the stove. Sophia busied herself shaking out their blankets and arranging their provisions. The domesticity of the scene was not lost on either of them. It echoed a life they might have had under different circumstances. As night fell and the temperature dropped further, they huddled near the stove, sharing a meal of jerky, hardtack, and coffee. Tell me about the documents, Mason said eventually. What exactly do they prove? Sophia sipped her coffee before answering. My father was an early investor in the Union Pacific Railroad. His shares represent a significant portion of the ownership. Theodore convinced him to name me as his heir, with Theodore as my guardian in financial matters. Her mouth twisted bitterly. What father didn't know was that Theodore had already arranged to sell those shares to another investor illegally, since they weren't his to sell. And these documents would prove the shares are yours. Yes, there's a trust document, properly notarized, stating that the shares passed directly to me upon my father's death, with no intermediary. There's also correspondence between Theodore and the buyer, which my father intercepted, proving his intent to defraud. Mason whistled low. No wonder he's so desperate to find them. Where are they hidden? In a safety deposit box at the Laramie National Bank. My father kept the key sewn into the lining of a Bible he gave me before I left for Boston. Theodore never suspected he's not a religious man. Do you still have the Bible? Sophia shook her head regretfully. Theodore took it when he first brought me to the mining outpost. But he doesn't know about the key. I removed it before he could discover it and hid it in the heel of my boot. She reached down to her borrowed boots. I managed to transfer it when I changed clothes at your cabin. Using a small knife from their provisions, she carefully pried at the heel of the left boot, revealing a small compartment. From it, she extracted a tiny brass key. Clever, Mason said admiringly. So our plan is to go to the bank, retrieve the documents, and then what? Take them to the law? Marshal Wilson in Laramie is an old friend of my father's. If we can get the documents to him, he'll make sure justice is served. Mason nodded slowly, considering the plan. Blackwell will be in Laramie, possibly with men looking for you. We'll need to be careful. I know it's dangerous, Sophia said softly. I wouldn't ask this of you if there were any other way. You didn't ask, Mason reminded her, reaching across to take her hand. I offered. There's a difference. Their eyes met across the small space, the firelight casting a warm glow on their faces. For a moment, it seemed as though time had rolled back, and they were those same young people who had once ridden across the Wyoming plains together, full of dreams and unspoken feelings. We should get some sleep, Mason said eventually, breaking the spell. You take the bunk. I'll sleep by the stove. Sophia looked as if she might protest, but nodded instead. Thank you, Mason, for everything. As he laid out his bedroll on the floor, Mason thought about the journey ahead. Laramie was still a day's ride away, and Theodore Blackwell wasn't a man to be underestimated. The stakes were high, not just Sophia's inheritance, but her freedom, and possibly her life. And yet, despite the danger, Mason couldn't help feeling that, somehow, things had come full circle. 5 years ago, he had watched her ride away, believing he would never see her again. Now, fate had brought her back to him, and this time, he wouldn't let her go without a fight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside the small shack, two people who had once lost each other drifted to sleep, each thinking of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the snow having stopped sometime in the night. They set out early, knowing they needed to reach Laramie before sunset if they wanted to access the bank. The trail was easier going now, the snow having compacted somewhat overnight. They made good time, stopping only briefly around midday to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. As they rode, Mason kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. But the landscape remained peaceful, the only movement coming from occasional wildlife and the steady plod of their horses through the snow. By mid-afternoon, the outskirts of Laramie came into view, first the smoke from chimneys, then the buildings themselves, nestled in the valley below. We should avoid the main street, Mason said as they approached. Blackwell might have men watching for you? Sophia nodded in agreement. There's a back entrance to the bank through the alley. The manager, Mr. Perkins, knows me. If we can get to him without being seen, he'll help us. They circled around to the eastern edge of town, where fewer people lived and worked. Leaving their horses tied in a small copse of trees, they proceeded on foot, staying to the shadows of buildings and alleyways. The bank stood on the corner of Main Street and First Avenue, a solid brick building with large windows facing the street. Mason peered around the corner of the Mercantile across the way, assessing the situation. 2 men standing outside the bank, he reported, ducking back into the alley. One of them matches the description you gave of Johnson, Blackwell's foreman. Sophia's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. There's another way. Through the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Henderson is a friend. The dressmaker's shop was 3 doors down from the bank, connected by a series of back alleys that ran behind the businesses on Main Street. They made their way there cautiously. Entering through the rear door, after Sophia's soft knock was answered by a gray-haired woman with kind eyes. "Sophia Montgomery, as I live and breathe," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed in a hushed voice. "We thought you were still back east." "It's a long story, Mrs. Henderson," Sophia replied, embracing the older woman. "We need to get to the bank without being seen. Theodore's men are watching the front." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. "So, that's why those rough types have been hanging about. Through the fitting room, then. Mr. Perkins keeps the connecting door unlocked during business hours." She led them through the shop to a small room in the back, filled with fabric samples and half-finished dresses. A narrow door in the corner opened to reveal a passageway that connected to the bank's rear offices. "Be careful, my dears," Mrs. Henderson whispered as they slipped through. "That Theodore Blackwell may look like a gentleman, but he has the heart of a snake." The passageway was dark and dusty, clearly not used often. They emerged into a small office at the back of the bank, startling a bespectacled man who was bent over a ledger. "Miss Montgomery!" he gasped, rising quickly to his feet. "I was just speaking with your husband about your accounts not an hour ago." "He is not my husband, Mr. Perkins," Sophia said firmly, "and I need to access my safety deposit box immediately." Mr. Perkins glanced nervously between Sophia and Mason, clearly uncertain. "Mr. Blackwell has presented documentation showing that he has authority over your affairs." "Forged documentation?" Sophia interrupted. "I have proof in my safety deposit box that will clear everything up. Please, Mr. Perkins, you've known me since I was a child. You know my father trusted you. I'm asking you to trust me now." The banker hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but quickly. Mr. Blackwell mentioned he would be returning later this afternoon." He led them to the vault at the back of the bank, checking first to ensure none of the tellers or customers could see them. Inside the vault, rows of metal boxes lined the walls. Mr. Perkins used his master key to unlock the section containing Sophia's box, then stepped back to allow her to use her own key. With trembling fingers, Sophia inserted the small brass key into the lock. The box opened with a soft click, revealing several document folders and a small velvet pouch. "These are them," she said, withdrawing the folders. "And this," she opened the pouch, tipping a gold locket into her palm, "was my mother's. I thought I'd never see it again." Mason kept watch at the vault door, while Sophia quickly examined the documents to ensure everything was there. "We need to get these to Marshal Wilson right away," she said, securing the papers inside her coat. Mr. Perkins wrung his hands anxiously. "Mr. Blackwell has been quite specific about anyone accessing these documents. He'll be most displeased." "Mr. Perkins," Mason said, his voice low but firm, "this woman has been held captive and mistreated by Blackwell. These documents prove he's been attempting to steal her inheritance. Now, you can either help us get these papers to the marshal, or you can explain to him later why you obstructed justice." The banker paled visibly. "Of course, I want to do what's right. The marshal's office is just down the street. If you go out the back way and around through the livery stable, you should be able to avoid being seen from the main street." They thanked him and retraced their steps through the passageway to Mrs. Henderson's shop. The dressmaker provided Sophia with a shawl to cover her distinctive hair and face as they slipped out the back door into the alley. The livery stable was busy with the afternoon traffic of horses and wagons, providing good cover as they made their way through to the street where the marshal's office stood. They were just crossing the street when a shout went up behind them. "There she is! Stop them!" Mason turned to see Johnson and another man pushing through the crowd toward them. "Run!" he urged Sophia, drawing his revolver. They sprinted the remaining distance to the marshal's office, bursting through the door just as a shot rang out, splintering the wooden frame inches from Mason's head. Inside, Marshal Wilson jumped to his feet, his hand automatically going to his gun. "What in tarnation?" "Marshal Wilson," Sophia gasped. "I'm Sophia Montgomery, Judge Montgomery's daughter. This man," she gestured to Mason, "is Mason Reed. He rescued me from captivity. Theodore Blackwell has been holding me prisoner to force me to reveal the location of these documents. She thrust the papers toward the lawman just as the door burst open again, revealing Johnson and his companion, guns drawn. "Put those weapons down," Marshal Wilson commanded, his own revolver now pointed steadily at the intruders. "This is my office, and I don't take kindly to people shooting up my town." Johnson hesitated, his eyes darting between the marshal, Mason, and Sophia. "This woman is the wife of Theodore Blackwell, Marshal. She's unwell, been having delusions. We're here to take her home where she belongs." "That's a lie," Mason said evenly, his gun still trained on Johnson. "She has never been legally married to Blackwell. The documents she just handed the marshal prove that Blackwell has been attempting to defraud her of her inheritance." Marshal Wilson, a veteran lawman with a reputation for fairness, kept his gun steady as he reached for the papers with his free hand. "Everyone stay calm while I take a look at these." The tension in the room was palpable as the marshal quickly scanned the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hard. "Johnson, you and your friend there put your guns on my desk, real slow. You're both under arrest for assault and attempted kidnapping." "You can't," Johnson began, but the marshal cut him off. "I most certainly can, and based on what I'm reading here, I'll be issuing a warrant for Theodore Blackwell as well. Where is he?" "The Grand Hotel," Sophia supplied. "He's been staying there while conducting business in town." The marshal nodded to his deputy, who had been standing silently in the corner throughout the exchange. "Go to the hotel. Bring Blackwell in. Take a couple of the town deputies with you. He may not come peacefully." As the deputy departed, Marshal Wilson directed Johnson and his companion to the cells at the back of the office. Only when they were safely locked away did he holster his weapon and turn his full attention to Sophia and Mason. "Now, Miss Montgomery, I think you'd better tell me the whole story." For the next hour, Sophia recounted everything that had happened since her father's death, Theodore's increasingly controlling behavior, his rage when he discovered the railroad shares weren't his to sell, her capture and imprisonment when she refused to reveal the location of the documents proving her ownership. Mason added his part of the story, explaining how he had tracked the rustlers to the abandoned mining outpost and discovered Sophia there. Marshal Wilson listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, shaking his head gravely. "Your father was a good man and a fine judge. He'd be proud of your courage, Miss Montgomery." He turned to Mason. "And you, Reed, not many men would have taken on such a fight for someone else." "It wasn't for someone else," Mason said quietly, his eyes meeting Sophia's. "It was for her." The simple statement hung in the air, filled with meaning that didn't escape anyone in the room. The marshal cleared his throat. "Well, based on these documents and your testimony, I have more than enough to hold Blackwell. The circuit judge will be through in 2 weeks. Until then." He was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door burst open to reveal the deputy, looking agitated. "Marshal, Blackwell's gone. Checked out of the hotel not 20 minutes ago. The desk clerk said he was in an all-fired hurry, had his bags already packed." Marshal Wilson cursed under his breath. "He must have spotted you two, or gotten word from someone who did." He turned back to Mason and Sophia. "This complicates things. Blackwell's dangerous, and now he's desperate. He won't take the loss of those shares lightly." "What do we do now?" Sophia asked, unconsciously moving closer to Mason. "I'll wire the surrounding towns, alert them to be on the lookout," the marshal said. "But in the meantime, you two need to lie low. Blackwell knows you're in Laramie, and he'll be looking for revenge." Mason nodded, his mind already working on a plan. "We can't go back to my ranch, that's the first place he'd look. But I have a friend who runs a trading post up in the Big Horns. Blackwell wouldn't know to look for us there." "Good thinking," Marshal Wilson agreed. "I'll arrange an escort to get you out of town safely. Once Blackwell is apprehended, I'll send word." As they made preparations to leave, Sophia pulled Mason aside. "Are you sure about this? You've already risked so much for me. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to walk away now." Mason took her hands in his expression serious. "Sophia Montgomery, I lost you once. I'm not about to lose you again. Wherever you go, I go. That's just how it is." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she gazed up at him. "When we were young, I used to dream that you would say something like that to me." "I should have said it then," Mason admitted. maybe things would have been different. Maybe, she agreed softly. Or maybe we needed this time apart to understand what we truly wanted. Their moment was interrupted by the marshal clearing his throat. The escort's ready. You'll be traveling with Deputy Barnes and 2 trustworthy men from the town militia. They'll see you safely to this trading post of yours. They gathered their few possessions and retrieved their horses from where they had left them. The deputy and 2 armed men on horseback met them at the edge of town, away from curious eyes. As they rode out, Sophia cast one last glance back at Laramie. Somewhere out there, Theodore Blackwell was plotting his next move. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope. With Mason beside her, and justice finally in motion, she could begin to imagine a future free from fear. The journey to the trading post took 3 days, through increasingly rugged terrain, as they ascended into the Bighorn Mountains. Deputy Barnes and the militiamen were vigilant, taking turns keeping watch at night and scouting ahead during the day. There was no sign of pursuit, but none of them were willing to take chances. Sophia rode with a new confidence, her strength returning with each passing day away from Theodore's influence. At night, around the campfire, she and Mason would talk, rediscovering each other and sharing dreams they had once been too young or too cautious to voice. On the evening of the second day, as they sat slightly apart from the others, Mason asked the question that had been on his mind since finding her. If you could have anything now, Sophia, what would it be? She gazed into the fire, considering her answer. Peace, she said finally. A place where I belong. A life with meaning. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the flames. What about you? Mason smiled softly. Funny thing is, I thought I knew. Thought I wanted to build the biggest ranch in the territory, prove something to all those folks who looked down on the orphan boy taken in by the Reeds. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But now, I'm not so sure that's what matters most. Sophia leaned into his touch, her heart beating faster. What does matter most, Mason Reed? This, he said simply, and leaned forward to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But when Sophia responded, winding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more profound, a promise, a homecoming, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I should have done that 5 years ago, on the day you left. Yes, Sophia agreed with a small laugh. You should have. Deputy Barnes tactfully cleared his throat from across the campfire, reminding them they weren't alone. They moved apart slightly, but their hands remained entwined as they watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The trading post, when they reached it the following afternoon, proved to be a sturdy log structure nestled in a small valley, with a creek running nearby and a spectacular view of the surrounding peaks. Samuel Mitchell, Mason's friend and the proprietor, welcomed them warmly after their escort explained the situation. Any friend of Mason's is welcome here, he assured Sophia. And anyone hiding from Theodore Blackwell has my sympathy. The man's reputation precedes him, even in these remote parts. The deputy and militiamen stayed only long enough to rest their horses before beginning the journey back to Laramie. Deputy Barnes promised to send word as soon as Blackwell was apprehended. Marshal Wilson won't rest until he's brought to justice, he assured them. In the meantime, stay vigilant. Blackwell's not the type to give up easily. After they departed, Samuel showed Sophia and Mason to a small cabin behind the main trading post. It's not much, he apologized, but it's private and the roof doesn't leak. It's perfect, Sophia assured him, taking in the simple furnishings. A bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small stove, and shelves lined with books. Thank you for your hospitality. Think nothing of it, Samuel replied with a wave of his hand. Mason helped me out of a tight spot a few years back. I'm just returning the favor. Left alone in the cabin, an awkward silence fell between them. The intimacy they had shared around the campfire suddenly seemed daring in the confines of the small space. I can sleep in the trading post, Mason offered, sensing her discomfort. Samuel has a spare bunk in the storeroom. Sophia shook her head. No, I don't want to be alone. We can share the space. It's not as if we haven't been sleeping near each other for days now. But they both knew it was different here, in this private cabin, with no deputy or militiamen nearby, no imminent danger to distract them from the growing feelings between them. As evening fell, they settled into a domestic routine, Mason building a fire in the stove, while Sophia arranged their few provisions on the shelves. Samuel had provided them with fresh bread, dried meat, coffee, and other essentials. They ate a simple meal together, their conversation flowing more easily as they relaxed in the safety of the isolated trading post. After dinner, Mason found a deck of cards, and they played several hands of poker, laughing as Sophia proved to be unexpectedly skilled. "My father would be scandalized," she admitted with a grin as she gathered her winnings, just matchsticks. But she had accumulated quite a pile. He never approved of ladies gambling. "There seems to be a lot your father didn't approve of," Mason observed, shuffling the cards for another round. Sophia's smile faded slightly. He was a man of his time, with certain ideas about how things should be. But he loved me in his way. That's why he sent me east. He truly believed it was for my own good. And now? What do you believe is for your own good? She met his gaze steadily. "I believe in choosing my own path, in listening to my heart instead of society's expectations." "And what is your heart telling you now?" Mason asked softly, the cards forgotten in his hands. Sophia stood, moving around the table to stand before him. With gentle fingers, she took the cards from his hands and set them aside. Then, showing a boldness that would have shocked Boston society, she bent down and kissed him. Mason responded immediately, rising to his feet and pulling her close. This kiss was different from the one they had shared by the campfire, more urgent, more honest. A statement rather than a question. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Mason searched her face. "Are you sure, Sophia? After everything you've been through?" "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the blush coloring her cheeks. "I've wasted too many years already, Mason. I don't want to waste another moment." That night, they discovered each other anew, not as the boy and girl who had once ridden wild across the Wyoming plains, but as a man and woman who had found their way back to each other against all odds. Their coming together was tender at first, mindful of the ordeal Sophia had endured, but it soon gave way to a passion that had been building for years. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, listening to the wind whistling around the eaves of the cabin, Sophia rested her head on Mason's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "What happens now?" she asked, tracing patterns on his skin with her fingertip. Mason's arm tightened around her. "Now we wait for word that Blackwell's been captured. Then we can decide our next steps. And if he isn't captured, if he comes looking for us," Mason's expression hardened in the dim light, "then I'll be waiting for him. He won't hurt you again, Sophia. I promise you that." She pressed a kiss to his chest, over his heart. "I believe you, but I'm not the same woman he imprisoned either. I won't be a victim again." "No," Mason agreed, pride evident in his voice. "You most certainly won't." Days at the trading post fell into a peaceful rhythm. Samuel's Shoshone wife, Mourning Dove, took Sophia under her wing, teaching her to prepare traditional foods and sharing stories of her people. Mason helped Samuel with the daily operation of the trading post, repairing things around the property and assisting with customers, mostly trappers and the occasional prospector coming down from the higher elevations. In the evenings, they would gather in Samuel and Mourning Dove's home for meals and conversation. Sometimes Shoshone friends would visit, bringing news from the surrounding areas and sharing in the communal atmosphere. A week passed with no word from Laramie. Then, 2. Mason could sense Sophia growing restless, despite the relative comfort and safety of their temporary haven. "We can't hide forever," she said one evening as they walked along the creek, enjoying the last of the day's sunlight. "Sooner or later, we need to face what's waiting for us back in the world." Mason nodded, understanding her concern. The circuit judge should have been through Laramie by now. Even if they haven't caught Blackwell, the judge will have reviewed your documents and made a ruling on the ownership of the railroad shares. "Which means I could claim my inheritance," Sophia mused. "Start a new life." "Is that what you want? To start a new life?" Mason asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, despite the sudden anxiety her words provoked. Would this new life include him? Or was she thinking of returning east once her affairs were in order? Sophia stopped walking, turning to face him fully. What I want, Mason Reed, is a life with you. Whether that's on your ranch or in Laramie or somewhere else entirely, I don't much care, as long as we're together. Relief washed over him, followed quickly by a surge of love so strong it nearly took his breath away. I want that too, he said, taking her hands in his. More than anything. But I need to know you're choosing me because it's truly what you want, not just because I happen to be the one who found you. Sophia's expression softened. Oh, Mason, don't you understand? You're the only one I knew would come for me. Not because you happened to find me, but because some part of me always believed you were out there, still caring about me despite everything. When I was at my lowest, it was thoughts of you that kept me going. Mason pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Then let's go back, he said decisively. Tomorrow, we'll face whatever's waiting together. The journey back to Laramie was tense but uneventful. They traveled with a small caravan of traders heading to town for supplies, providing safety in numbers. Samuel had insisted on accompanying them, his rifle across his saddle and his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. As they approached the outskirts of Laramie, Mason felt Sophia stiffen beside him. He reached across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand reassuringly. Whatever happens, we face it together, he reminded her. The town appeared unchanged as they rode down Main Street toward the marshal's office. A few people recognized Sophia, pointing and whispering as they passed. News traveled fast in a place like Laramie. Marshal Wilson looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Well, look who's back. I was beginning to think you two had decided to make a permanent home in those mountains. Any news of Blackwell? Mason asked, coming straight to the point. The marshal's smile faded. None. It's like he vanished into thin air. We've had telegrams out to every town within 100 miles, but there's been no sign of him. Sophia's shoulders slumped slightly, but her voice remained steady. And the circuit judge? Did he review my case? He did, Marshal Wilson confirmed, rummaging through the papers on his desk. Found in your favor, Miss Montgomery. The railroad shares are legally yours, and he's issued a warrant for Blackwell's arrest on charges of fraud, kidnapping, and assault. Relief flooded through Sophia. So it's over. Legally, at least. Legally, yes, the marshal agreed. But I'd still watch your back until Blackwell's behind bars. A man with that much to lose is dangerous. They thanked the marshal and left the office, stepping back into the bright sunlight of the street. Samuel had gone to arrange rooms for them at the Laramie Hotel, a more respectable establishment than the Grand Hotel where Blackwell had stayed. What now? Mason asked as they walked, unconsciously positioning himself between Sophia and the street, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Now, I need to visit the bank again, Sophia decided. Make arrangements for my inheritance. Then, she glanced up at him, a small smile playing at her lips. Then, I was thinking we might pay a visit to Reverend Collins. Mason stopped walking, turning to face her. Reverend Collins? The preacher? Sophia's smile widened. Unless you know another man who can perform a marriage ceremony in these parts. For a moment, Mason simply stared at her, processing her words. Then, a slow grin spread across his face. Sophia Montgomery, did you just propose to me in the middle of Main Street? She laughed, the sound light and free in a way he hadn't heard since finding her chained in that cellar. I believe I did, and you haven't given me an answer yet, Cowboy. Instead of replying, Mason swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a kiss that drew startled looks and a few cheers from passers-by. When he finally set her down, both of them breathless and laughing, he brushed a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. Yes, he said simply. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Yes. They completed their business at the bank, where Mr. Perkins was significantly more helpful now that the circuit judge had ruled in Sophia's favor. The railroad shares were substantial, providing her with a considerable income that would allow her them to build whatever future they desired. As they left the bank, documents secured safely in Mason's saddlebag, a sense of optimism surrounded them, despite the lingering threat of Blackwell. They had faced so much already. Surely the future could only be brighter. That optimism was shattered as they rounded the corner near the hotel and found themselves face to face with Theodore Blackwell himself. He looked different from when Sophia had last seen him, thinner, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his normally clean-shaven face. His once immaculate suit was wrinkled and trail-worn, but the most striking change was in his eyes, cold and hard, with a desperation that made them dangerous. "Sophia," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "I've been waiting for you to return." Mason moved protectively in front of her, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Back away, Blackwell. The marshal has a warrant for your arrest. This is over." Blackwell's lip curled in a sneer. "Over?" "It's not over until I say it's over." His right hand emerged from his coat pocket, revealing a small Derringer pistol. "I've lost everything because of her. My reputation, my business connections, the fortune that should have been mine. If I can't have it, no one will." Several things happened simultaneously. Blackwell raised the Derringer, aiming at Sophia. Mason drew his own weapon with lightning speed, and a shot rang out but not from either of their guns. Blackwell staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face, as a red stain blossomed on his chest. He crumpled to the ground, the Derringer falling unfired from his hand. Mason spun around to see Marshal Wilson standing several yards away, rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "I've been watching the hotel," the marshal explained as he approached, keeping his rifle trained on Blackwell's prone form. Figured he might be bold enough to come back when he heard Miss Montgomery had returned. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. The marshal knelt beside Blackwell, checking for signs of life. "He's alive, but barely," he announced, looking up at Mason and Sophia. "Someone fetch the doctor." As several bystanders hurried to obey, Mason pulled Sophia into his arms, shielding her from the sight of the man who had caused her so much pain. "Are you all right?" he asked, searching her face. She nodded, pale but composed. "Yes. It's truly over now, isn't it?" "It is," Marshal Wilson confirmed, rising to his feet as two men from the crowd helped him lift Blackwell onto a makeshift stretcher. "Whether he lives or dies, he'll never threaten you again." Theodore Blackwell did not die. The doctor managed to remove the bullet and stabilize him, though he would never fully recover from his wound. He was eventually transported to the Territorial prison in Cheyenne, where he would serve a 20-year sentence for his crimes. The news reached Mason and Sophia a week after their wedding, a simple but joyous affair, attended by Samuel and Mourning Dove, Marshal Wilson, Mrs. Henderson, and a few other friends from Laramie. They received the telegram on the front porch of Mason's ranch house, which was rapidly being transformed with Sophia's touch. New curtains hung in the windows. A garden had been started behind the house, and plans were underway for an expansion to accommodate the family they hoped to have. 20 years, Sophia mused, setting the telegram aside. By the time he's released, we'll have built a life he can never touch. Mason pulled her into his lap as they sat on the porch swing he had built as a wedding present. "We've already started," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And speaking of building a life," he placed his hand gently over her stomach, where the slightest curve was just becoming noticeable. Their first child, conceived during those peaceful days at the trading post, was due to arrive in the winter. Sophia covered his hand with her own, smiling up at him. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never finding each other again? If you hadn't been tracking those rustlers?" "I don't believe it was chance," Mason said thoughtfully, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I think some people are meant to find their way back to each other, no matter what tries to keep them apart." "Is that so, Mr. Reed?" Sophia teased, though her eyes were soft with emotion. "I never took you for a romantic." "Only with you, Mrs. Reed," he replied, kissing her softly. "Only with you." As twilight settled over the Wyoming plains, they remained on the porch, talking softly about their plans for the future, the cattle herd Mason wanted to expand, the investments Sophia was making with her inheritance, the room they would prepare for their child. Simple dreams, perhaps, but precious to two people who had nearly lost everything. Inside the house, Miguel was preparing dinner, having chosen to stay on as ranch foreman when Mason offered him the position. The smell of fresh bread and beef stew wafted through the open windows, a homely scent that spoke of security and belonging. Later that night, as they lay in each other's arms, Sophia thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, From the frightened, chained woman in that cellar to the confident wife and expectant mother she now was, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About chains," she replied. "The physical ones you freed me from, but also the invisible ones, fear, doubt, society's expectations. How breaking free of them led me here, to you." Mason brushed a kiss against her hair. "No more chains," he promised. "Just wide open spaces and all the time in the world." "I like the sound of that," Sophia murmured, nestling closer to him as sleep began to claim her. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song across the plains, a lullaby for two souls who had found their way home at last. Spring arrived, bringing with it new life to match the one growing within Sophia. Calves were born, the garden sprouted, and the expansion to the house was completed just in time for the baby's arrival. Margaret Rose Reed was born on a clear April morning in 1873, with Mourning Dove serving as midwife, and Mason pacing anxiously outside until the first cry of his daughter brought him rushing in. She had Sophia's green eyes and Mason's dark hair, and from the moment she took her first breath, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. Life settled into a rhythm of work and love and growth. Mason's ranch prospered, as did Sophia's investments. They built a reputation for fair dealing and generosity, becoming respected members of the community. Miguel eventually married a local woman and built a small house on the property, continuing as foreman, but now with a family of his own. When Margaret, or Maggie, as she was affectionately called, was 2, she was joined by a brother, James Henry Reed. A sister, Emma Louise, followed 3 years later. Theodore Blackwell became a distant memory, a shadow that occasionally crossed their minds, but no longer held any power over their happiness. They heard, through Marshall Wilson, that he had died in prison in 1882, never having served his full sentence. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Sophia with a locket to replace the one that had been her mother's, similar in design, but engraved with their initials and containing miniature portraits of their 3 children. "It's beautiful," she whispered as he fastened it around her neck. "Not half as beautiful as you," he replied, his love for her as strong as it had been on the day he found her chained in the snow. That night, as their children slept and the ranch lay quiet under a blanket of stars, they sat on the same porch swing, where they had received the news of Blackwell's imprisonment all those years ago. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Sophia asked, her head resting on Mason's shoulder. "If I hadn't been sent east, if we had spoken our hearts when we were young." Mason considered this, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I used to, but now I think everything happened just as it needed to. All the pain, all the separation, it led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." Sophia smiled, lifting her face for his kiss. "Here is home," she agreed, "and always will be, as long as we're together." In the years that followed, they watched their children grow, their ranch expand, and their love deepen with each passing season. There were challenges, of course, droughts, harsh winters, economic downturns, but they faced them together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. By the turn of the century, Mason and Sophia Reed were known throughout Wyoming as one of its founding families. Their children had children of their own, and the original ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the state. On cool evenings, they would still sit on their porch swing, replaced several times over the decades, but always in the same spot, and watch the sun set over the land they had nurtured together. Sometimes they would reminisce about the young cowboy and the judge's daughter who had found their way back to each other against all odds. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the Wyoming plains, Sophia would lean into Mason's embrace and whisper, "You're the only one I knew would come," to which he would always reply, with the certainty of a love that had withstood the test of time, "And I always will."